Reading. So a couple things before we get started on the message today. Some of you may know who I am. Some of you may think, who is this person standing in front of you? Kind of say that myself a lot when I look in the mirror. If you don't know, Pastor Steve is still on vacation. I'm not sure if he comes back next week or the week after, but I'm here instead. And I love the title I was given. Thank you. I love the title in the bulletin, really long and really small. Staff member at Banner Good Samaritan Hospital and member of Faith Church. So yes, I work at Banner Good Samaritan Hospital. Staff member is an interesting title. I used to be actually the director of spiritual care there and got a promotion, and now I'm what they call director of service excellence, which may mean nothing to many people, but essentially I try to help ensure that our patients have a really great experience while they're in the hospital, and if things go wrong, we correct it while they're there. So that's that for the title thing. I know that you probably saw me come in with a white Alban, and you wonder how I changed so quick. I thought maybe of doing it during the sermon, of kind of taking it off one bit. That was discussed in the back, but I was a little hot, so I thought instead of fainting before you, that maybe I would just shed some clothes, because believe it or not, pastors do wear clothes underneath their robes. When I was pastor of a church in northern Chicago, I was in the sacristy taking off my robe once, and somebody came in and they're like, "Oh, I'm sorry. And I'm like, "Really? I wear clothes under here." Come on in. So that's my introduction part. I know you're wondering if this is how the sermon's going to go, and yes, it is, but I'd actually like to pray first, if you would pray with me. Gracious God, may all the words that come out of my mouth not be my words, but be your words. Please, Lord, just make me a vessel so that people can hear the messages that they need to hear today. Open our eyes and hearts and minds so that we can truly hear what it is that you have in store for us. Amen. So it's been almost a year ago since I last preached here at Faith. So first, let me thank you for inviting me back. It must not have been so horrible because you let me come back. So first of all, let me thank you. It's truly a privilege. In the work that I do, I rarely get to have an opportunity to lead worship and preach much anymore, and it's one of the things that I actually truly love to do. If you were here last year, you may remember that I hate making up sermon titles. And I could rationalize that in a lot of ways. I know, and you're looking in your bulletin now, and go ahead, because there's no title there. There is no title there. Last year, if you may remember, I decided I would title my sermon, "Liar, Liar, Pants on Fire." And the reason I don't title my sermons is because usually I don't write my sermons until Saturday evening. So I don't know what I would even title them when they ask, so I usually am just making it up, so I prefer to have that blank slate. But for today's title for the sermon, I thought, although I think Leaf had a great sermon title there, Jesus is a Jerk. I might just adopt that one. I don't know if you heard him say that. Jesus is a jerk, but I was going to call it, "Now That's a Woman I Could Be Friends With." So again, for those of you who were here last year, you might remember we also had kind of a little scriptural teaching time. Not that I would have to say you did great on it. I kind of wondered where everybody grew up and what Bible lessons you had. So I thought we might repeat that a little bit. Just, for education purposes, no blame, no shame in this. So this is going to require your participation. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, great. So it may just require you at times to just raise your hand. It may require times that, because we're not shouting out answers, we are a controlled group. If there's a question and you know the answer, you can raise your hand and I'll call on you. I know, I'm a little controlling, aren't I? But let's start off with hopefully an easy question. If it's not, look to your neighbor, I'll let you cheat. Look side by side. How many Gospels are there in the Bible? Okay, raise your hand. Kim? There are 4 Gospels. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I agree. Have you ever wondered why there's 4 Gospels? I mean, wouldn't one be enough? Who's ever wondered that question? Anyone? Okay, a few of you. Ponder. Thank you, Leaf. I agree. The 4 elements. Oh. Air, fire, water, earth. You know, I've never heard that, Leaf. Or the 4 directions. I like that. That's really interesting. Well, you would kind of wonder. Thank you. Wow, I got my own education today, didn't I? That just turned right around on me. Always open to learning. Has anybody ever wondered why there's some stories that only occur in 2 of the Gospels, but not all 4 of the Gospels? Anybody ever noticed that before? Anybody ever wondered if there were actually more than 4 Gospels written? See? Nice. Somebody's like, what? There's more than 4 Gospels? What do you mean? Who could name at least one other gospel that was written that didn't make it into the Bible? You are quick. I'm calling on you. Exactly, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. Interesting. Anybody read that yet? If you haven't, go out to your bookstore. They have it. Anybody else name another gospel that was written that was never made? Yeah, Dave? Gospel of Thomas. Absolutely. What's that? Yes. I'm sorry, I don't hear well. I really need a hearing test. Anybody else? Gospel of Judas, actually. So it's interesting if you actually think about the fact that we have 4 Gospels for a particular reason, and that those were the 4 Gospels that were chosen actually out of many Gospels that were written. So I want to tell you a little bit about the Gospel of Matthew that our story comes out of today. And although it's listed as the first gospel in the New Testament, anybody know which was actually the first gospel written? Mark, the Gospel of Mark, absolutely. Which, if you know anything about Mark, kind of like the Gospel of Mark, the original ending to the Gospel of Mark actually ended in the 16th verse, or 16th chapter at the 8th verse. And here's how the original ending of Mark read. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, and they were afraid. There you go. A little hard to get the resurrection story out that way, but... So many people don't know that the ending to Mark was actually added on later. Now there's an original very short ending which said, yeah, and then they went and proclaimed the good news to everyone everywhere. I mean, it's 1 verse. That's always fun. And then you have the rest of it that kind of, adds some more information to that. And in the Gospel of Mark, if you actually look at it, Jesus is the most human of all the emotions and of any of the Gospels. He's pretty much what Leaf said earlier. He was a jerk. He doesn't necessarily come off as this nice guy. He's not the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus in the paintings who gathers all the children on his lap, right, that we all grew up with. All right, maybe he had brown hair and brown eyes. I'll concede that. Okay, you know I'm joking, right, because he grew up in the Middle East. Just checking with him. All right. So in the Gospel of Mark, not only is he just kind of a little bit cranky going around doing his ministry at times because he gets tired and he goes out on the water and he does this stuff, but the disciples, and we heard it earlier as well, kind of come off as bumbling idiots. They never get it. So even in earlier, it's like, could you explain that to us, please? Right? We didn't quite get that. Could you explain that parable to us? We didn't quite get that. Well, in Mark, it's really like, and as he says to Peter today, are you stupid? how do you not get this? Not really the Jesus that we tend to think about. So Mark was the first one written. Actually, Matthew and Luke were the second two Gospels written, and they share stories with Mark, but they also share stories with each other that are very similar that we don't know where they came from. So it's biblical scholars actually believe that there was an oral tradition that was passed down of a gospel, and for their own reasons they call it Q, that was passed down orally after Jesus died. Because if you've ever wondered about this, when were the Gospels written? And who wrote them? Because in Jesus' time, you could always write as an author under somebody else's name. Now, we talked about the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. Some people believe, or there's been conjecture out there, that actually the Gospel of John was written by Mary because it's so different and written later. That's something to think about when you're reading John. So Matthew and Luke have these stories that Mark doesn't have, and if you think about them as a historical events, and I'm not saying that they didn't happen, but again, we get different pictures in the different Gospels with different stories that sometimes show up here and there, but not in other places. So they believe there was this oral tradition because that's how it happened. People didn't read and write. They told the stories to each other, much like our Native American tribes tell their stories, their wisdom, beliefs to each other through the stories as they sit around telling each other how this works, the value in their beliefs and their traditions. So it's not much different. So we have this story that actually shows up in Matthew, interestingly enough, doesn't show up in Luke, but does show up in Mark. And I'll get to that in a second. But Matthew, when he's writing, the two primary differences between Matthew and Luke is that Matthew is writing to a certain audience, and his audience is the Jews. His audience are the new believers in Christ. They don't call themselves Christians yet, but he's writing to this group of the Jews who are now followers of Christ. And if we know about Jewish history, we know that they are the called and chosen people. I like to think I'm called and chosen. But what happens is when we tend to think that we're called and chosen, we tend to divide ourselves up into us and them, we and they, and we separate people out. So Matthew is trying to write in his gospel to this group of people that actually sends a message that says, hey, look, it's not just us who are the chosen people. In the Gospel of Luke, Luke actually writes the gospel to all those outsiders, all those Gentiles, all those people who this gospel wasn't supposed to be for. All of those stories are written towards anyone who feels like you're on the outside. This story is for you, to know that you're part of us. So just understanding those basics as we go into the story today, that Matthew is written for this community of Jews who think that they are the chosen ones. So in this story, it's interesting that Matthew chooses to call this woman a Canaanite woman. This is a really old term back in the days of Abraham that separated out the Israelites from the Canaanites. They were not friends. This is not a contemporary title in this day and age for Jesus to be using. So Matthew in particular uses the term Canaanite woman to make sure that they understand this is not a friend who is coming and approaching Jesus. The lectionary for today I thought was really interesting. Wanted us to leave out the first verses. I know, right? It's shocking. I like when I get nonverbal feedback. Just like, really? So somehow the lectionary seemed to think that talking about what words come out of our mouths was completely separate from the story of the Canaanite woman. And I'd like to suggest that these stories are actually absolutely connected. Because we just heard from Jesus himself, it's not what goes into us and out of us that defiles us, or whether we wash our hands before we eat. Thank God we don't have to, not checklist. But it's the words that come out of our mouths. So Jesus himself just says these are what can defile. It's the words we say to each other that can hurt, that can either build up or tear down. We hear in the Gospel of John, the first verse, the Word was with God and the Word was God.